right, we're rolling. Can I just say one thing real quick? Everybody, this is to help with food. I'm gonna have this up on a clipboard just if you're willing to help next week. That's there. And then I'm gonna pray for us, and Lauren's gonna introduce herself and talk through the topic. But if you were here last week, you met her, and she's awesome. So, God, thanks so much for this evening, and Lord, I just pray that in our conversation tonight, God, that you're glorified. Lord, I pray that our hearts are open for us to see what you're doing in our world, and God, that sometimes if it means courage or risk or trying new things, we're willing to do that to move forward. God, we submit to you and follow you as Lord, and we pray this in your name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Well, hello, friends of Wellspring. Like David said, my name is Lauren, and I work locally at Modesto Junior College with an organization called InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. So it's a parachurch ministry that does mission on college campuses, and essentially we train students how to be Christian leaders on campus, how to reach out to their peers and share their faith, and how to study the Bible together. So that's kind of my context, that's where I come from. But Wellspring has been kind enough to let us host our leaders meetings this past year for our InterVarsity chapter at MJC in your youth room. It's been really great. And every time I've gotten to come and spend time with you all, I just really feel the love of Christ, and I love being here. So,
Thank you.
Yeah. So if you were here the last 2 weeks, you know that the first week we kind of covered that being a good missionary requires examining the culture that you're trying to reach, right? And by examining the culture and understanding it, you can then form good practices and know how to build relationships with people. And since we're all missionaries for Christ, it's an important thing to us. And then last week we talked about how the United States actually has a post-Christian culture these days. Can anybody, just really quickly in your own words, what does that mean when I say that the United States has a post-Christian culture? Do you remember what we talked about last week?
We used to be Christian.
It's part of it, yeah. Can I get maybe one more person to add on? What does it mean that we live in a post-Christian culture?
Well, it's actually, our culture is actually going against the core values of that right now.
Yeah, so living in a post-Christian culture, it kind of means that if you want to think about it, if like the church is on a road somewhere, the culture has driven past, right? Like it's going, and kind of where the church used to be a main cultural influence in America and a shaper of like policy and what was popular and what was socially acceptable. At this point, culture has kind of moved past that, and now there are other voices that are more influencing the culture, and also culture is doing more to influence the church than the church is to influence the culture.
We used to be the moral compass. Now who is the moral compass?
Yeah, there are many, right? That's kind of postmodernism. We've moved past one central truth to having multiplicative truths and different people having different perspectives, and it's kind of broken apart. There was this other word that David kept using, syncretism. Does anybody remember what that means?
I wrote it down, but I didn't write what it meant.
Well, good, we can fill it in right now.
Say the word again.
Syncretism?
Syncretism.
It's when two cultures are trying to synchronize and make a happy medium out of both of them.
Yeah, and we talked about it specifically in terms of like secular culture and the church, and how some people like to sort of blend them together, and it makes this third thing that isn't quite Christian culture, but we like to put them together sometimes and then make it look like it is. And that's sort of syncretism at work. So this week, we're going to move sort of past this abstract idea of a post-Christian culture, and we're going to move a little more into the practical of what does it mean for us to be living in a culture that maybe is not ours, right? What does it mean to be exiles as Christians in the modern American culture? And one idea that David had kind of put out to me that I thought really encapsulated the whole thing is us as Christians today, we often find ourselves wanting to live in the promised land or thinking that we do because America used to be talked about as a Christian culture. But actually, we're living more in Babylon. We're living in exile as people surrounded by a culture that isn't ours, that isn't Christian, and yet we want to hold on to our identity as Christians living in exile in this foreign place. I kind of want to bring back a few things that we talked about last week, specifically because this post-Christian idea, it means that our culture has kind of lost its Christian veneer, right? And to a certain extent, there's no longer a social pressure on everyone in the culture to kind of have this image of piety, whether it's true or not. And I actually think that's a benefit for us because it kind of levels the playing field and helps us to see what's actually happening in people's hearts and minds, right? David mentioned last week that only about 20% of Americans who actually identify or would use the word Christian for themselves hold what would be considered core Christian beliefs, right? Being able to say who Jesus is and that they believe in that and the work of the cross and God's purposes in the world. So it's just really clear that at this point we are a minority, right? We are no longer the majority in America, and we kind of have to own up to that and accept it as it is. It's hard, and in some ways that's something to mourn, and it's sad, but that's just the reality that we're living in. But actually we're not alone in this experience. I think if we look at the New Testament and the Old Testament and even Jesus' words, we see that from the beginning, right? The church has always kind of been on the margins or in exile. A people charged with living into an identity that isn't always validated or affirmed by the culture around them, right? And that's okay. We shouldn't expect to always be empowered or to be loved by the culture around us. We know historically that the church has grown the most and exploded the most in revival in some of the most intense periods of persecution. And so actually there's a lot of hope for being on the margins. That doesn't mean we've lost or that it's time to give up or something like that. But it's also okay to acknowledge that that's kind of a scary place to be, that not being in the center or not having power can feel really vulnerable and can feel like a losing battle. But I think Jesus encourages us that it's not, that that's actually exactly where we need to be. And the Bible doesn't really give a simple answer to like, this is what to do when you're in exile, this one thing, just go do that and it'll be perfect, right? Like, it's complex, but I think the Bible as a whole does give us a story to live by, and it does give us examples and principles that we can seek to be loyal to so that we can follow Jesus and continue to move his kingdom forward in the world, even as exiles. So what I want us to do, before we really get into like wrestling with this idea of what does it mean to live as exiles, I want us to look at some scripture. So I'm actually going to break us up into small groups and give us a few minutes to look at these different passages, and then we're going to take them and apply them to this topic and what can we learn. I think there's enough people for us to break up into groups of 3. So can you 3 right here be a group? Yep. And can you 3 right here be a group? 1, 2, 3. Do you 3 want to be a group?
Sure.
And then we could do this row right here, a group of 3, and then we can have a group of 4 in the back row. Is that okay? And I have Bibles up here if you all need.
Yes.
Maybe raise your hand if you need a Bible. Okay, great.
Need a Bible. This is my phone.
Here you go. Does anyone else need one?
Pick the first one.
Okay. Let's have this group right here. Can you do 1 Peter? And also this group right here. Can you read 1 Peter? We'll have this group on the side here. Can you read the Genesis passage? And then the 2 groups in the back, can you read the Jeremiah passage? And I'm going to give us about 5 minutes just to read that together as a small group. And then I will move us on to the next thing that I want us to do with these passages. Before I just let you do that, does anyone have any questions about what we're doing right now?
You want us to read it to each other, or what?
Yeah, just all of you to be able to read it. You can all read it together if you want, or take turns reading it separately, but just make sure everyone gets to have their eyes on the passage and read it at least once.
In the middle. I don't know. I hate being in the middle. Okay.
You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a nation,
And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. During 7 years of abundance, the land produced. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in his fridge. In each city, he put the food grown in the fields around it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond
This
measure.
is what the Lord Almighty does.
Before the
All
Lord
those
carriages were born to Joseph by
Submit yourself.
Bill House.
However you say it, we're gonna agree.
Yeah, it's fine.
priest of all. Joseph names his firstborn.
But you are chosen.
It is because God has made me all my
That you
treasure.
may declare
All
the
rights
righteous
of
acts of him.
The second son of the city,
Which is carried into exile.
Once you were
for
Lord,
it is because God has made me
you were the people of God. You are the people of God.
Yes.
Once you had not received
7
mercy,
years of
but
abundance.
now you have received mercy.
Not let the prophets of diviner.
Give about 3 more minutes. If you've already read it, maybe take one more time through, just so you have it in your mind.
Strangers encourage them
There
to
was
have.
famine
They
in
are
all
practicing
lands,
lies.
but in the whole land of
I have not sent them.
Egypt there was food. When all Egypt
This is
began,
what the Lord
all
says.
field of
70
famine,
years
they
are
cried
completed for
fear.
Babylon. I will come to you and fulfill
Pharaoh
my gracious
told all
promise
his
to bring you
Egyptians
back
to
for
Joseph
me.
and say what he
For I know the plans I
And
have for you,
famine had
declares
spread
the
over
Lord.
the whole
Plans to prosper you and
The
not
sword
harm
and
you.
sword and
Plans
swords
to
that
give
went
you
to the
hope and
Egyptians
future.
were sins.
Then you will call upon me and pray to me.
Oh, wait,
Listen.
and
You will seek me
and all
and
countries
find me.
came to
For it
you
is God's
by
power
rain
that
and
doeth good
because of
you
famine.
should
And will be found by you, declares the
cause
Lord,
of foolish men.
and will bring you
Live
back
as
in
free
captivity.
men for God.
I will gather you from all the nations and places
When our day
where I
Joseph
have
was in the
abandoned you.
land.
An entrepreneur.
If you've already read all the way through, in your small groups, I want you to discuss specifically for your passage these 3 questions. So just start at the top and look at your passage and see how did the people or the main actor in the passage react to being in this position of exile. What was God's direction for them, and how are they being God's people in the middle of that? And maybe how are they invited to shift their posture if you see that in the text. I'm going to give you another couple of minutes just to talk about that in your groups, and then we'll share in the larger group what we saw.
How did they react to the exile? Well,
Well,
they want,
Joseph was in a position of
culture, interaction,
travel throughout the country. Prior to this, he'd already said what he was doing. He was fulfilling what he had said and was actually told by God to do.
Prophets that went to exile and
Well,
were
there's a lot.
telling lies, making
But
images.
interesting that during those before the years of famine came, which means it was in the time of abundance,
Silence day.
he had the 2 daughters who said that God was going to get all the trouble my father suffered.
Submit yourselves to the Lord's sake, to the authorities of
Jeremiah
his
told
Household.
them, don't just separate yourself and be
So in that time of abundance, he
total
felt that was God.
alienated, you know, be part of the
The other
culture
group
and try to
contributed to a bang.
contribute to prosperity.
Yeah, definitely.
Contributed to society, the pagans.
Right, right.
And that's part of, he's being fruitful and multiplying. like we talked about.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, God prepared him to reach out to those during the time of famine, but he was able to. If you think of it as a missionary thing, when people are with you or something, you've got something to share to with them that is important for them. Maybe they don't.
No, it says right here, to show proper respect to everyone. Love and brotherhood of believers.
Actions for him.
You should be
God revealed. Certainly not in the beginning.
You know,
So he shifted his posture, I guess, by just adapting to where he was at and what he was called to do.
why have you done this? As if they didn't know.
And he was smart enough
So maybe that's one of the reactions.
recognize that while there was an abundance, they
building
better
up
do
to that.
something to save it because the famine was coming.
That's where the rubber
I
meets the
urge
road
you,
between whether you're a
as
Christian or
aliens,
not.
I'll give you about 2 more minutes.
strangers in
Because,
the world.
How
well,
are they
he was
invited
in the
to
leadership
stay
role,
in
God
our
put him in a leadership role.
Yeah.
How are they being
Which
invited to
war
shift it?
against
Well,
your
they can
soul.
see your example, is what they
Well,
do.
yeah. It says, how are they being invited to
You
share?
know, it's by your example.
I would say that, forgetting the trouble of the Father's household is,
Because as an example for others.
That's how they're being invited.
Yeah.
Well, apparently I grabbed the wrong one. This is the one that's followed.
This is your thin line, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so
When I was choosing.
that might have felt like too much time or not enough time, but either way, I think as we talk all together, we'll be able to flesh out some of the answers to these questions and then be able to learn from them. And I just want to recognize that I lead things in kind of a more workshop style, so really we're all going to be working together and bringing all of our experiences and understanding and knowledge together to be able to answer this question of how do we live faithfully as Christians in exile. So what we're gonna do first is just to catch everybody up on the few passages. I'd like someone from each of the small groups that had a different passage to just quickly sum up what your passage was about or what was the main story in it. So let's start with, does somebody from a small group that had Genesis, which I think was just y'all, want to sum up real quick, what was that passage about?
Well, this was a passage of when Joseph, who had been taken to Egypt, and was now, instead of being in prison and everything, he'd been elevated to a position of power, and he was fulfilling that authority that he had
Yeah. Yes.
in that time.
How about a group that had the Jeremiah passage? Do you want to sum up what that was about?
Well, we didn't think our passage, well, you had it too, didn't you?
Yeah.
We didn't think our passage had a lot about the reaction, but I remember there's a song which might have been written about this time that really complained to God, why are you doing this?
Do you want, for people who didn't read it, do you want to summarize what was the passage? Like, what was it
It's
describing?
supposed to have, what, go ahead.
It's mostly instruction.
Instructions that they were in exile and they just continued living their lives as they had, marrying, planting gardens, having children and whatnot. But they were warned not to listen to essentially the culture around them. And ultimately, God promised them deliverance from
Yeah.
activities.
So it's a bit of prophecy through Jeremiah to Israel, who was in exile in Babylon at the time. And lastly, the 1 Peter passage, kind of like what was the main subject of the passage? Does someone want to sum it up?
It kind of pointed out toward how, as believers, we are aliens in this world, and that God wants us to submit to the governments that we're situated in, but also to show love, to do the right thing, to abstain from evils, and show respect, and mainly to by our actions to glorify God, so people can see who Christians are through their actions.
Yeah.
And by our actions, to being passive, not being abrasive, and not being showing off, and not taking advantage of our freedom.
Yeah, there's a lot of like really deep, really great direction that I think we can learn from in each one of these passages, and that I think is really relevant to today, actually. So knowing that some of us each had different passages, though, we're still going to look through the same 3 questions. So let's just start here, and for some of us in our passages, it might be a little more clear how the people who are in exile felt, and for some of us, it might be a little bit more about interpreting how it might have felt to be in that situation. But what did you guys talk about for this first question? How the people in your passage were reacting to being exiles?
Well, it seemed like the reason why God put him in exile was so that they would seek him and have a deep longing for him.
So then it's kind of interesting, it implies that they weren't seeking him, and now they're in this place where they have to change right? And that might be kind of hard. Yeah. Anybody else? Your passage, how did you see people reacting or feeling about being in exile?
Well, in ours, Joseph had a role of responsibility of becoming leadership under that situation. And God has given him directions on what to do.
Yeah, and he like seizes that opportunity, right? He's not just like, oh, that would be hard. This sucks. He actually does it, right? Yeah. So
First Peter says that, do it by example. Be the example, the good deeds.
Yeah. Some of the context of First Peter makes it really interesting because he is constantly reminding them, like, live your lives out in the open and be an example to people, which makes me wonder if maybe they were being tempted to kind of pull back and hide because Peter, or the author of First Peter, was writing to a group of people that were being persecuted. You might want to like withdraw and hide and like not be out in the open so that it would be harder to be persecuted, right? But Peter is telling them, no, like live your lives out in the open and live out with good deeds so that people can see you. So they might be tempted to hide.
And maybe they weren't Christian enough, when they were exiled. Maybe that's what one of the problems they had, that they didn't know how to act.
Maybe just want to blend in.
Yeah.
Well, and they were also asked to submit to the rulers for his sake.
Yeah.
For the Lord's sake.
So kind of on that point, let's move into like, if we were going to pull out what were God's like specific directions to the people in each of these passages. So yours, one of them is
Just
to like work with the power of the land. Don't like constantly be going against it. Yeah. What were some other directions that God was giving people?
Obey authority.
Mm-hmm.
Increase, don't decrease.
Yeah.
As far as, that's an interesting one.
Yeah, increase.
Have lots of children.
Keep living your lives.
Be fruitful and multiply.
Right.
Yeah, it sounds like many other passages, right?
Abstain from sinfulness, don't become like them.
Yeah, like keep your like sense of wanting to be holy as your Father in heaven is holy, right? Value holiness.
And lead by example.
Yeah. Anything else that we found? in our
Pray to the
passages?
Lord for your captors, because if they prosper, you will too.
Yeah, which sounds a lot like when Jesus says, pray for your enemies, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. We got a lot.
that stuck out at me.
Any other things that we found?
And just live out the position that God has put you in.
Do you want to say more about that? What do you, how do you see that?
He came as an exile, was imprisoned, and then pulled out and put into authority. So he could have just said, forget you. But he sort of, again, like how did they react? He sees the opportunity, he just obeyed God and what he felt God had led him to do.
Yeah, kind of in both Joseph's story and then also in the Jeremiah passage, I see God telling the people to serve those around them, right? In Jeremiah, he specifically says, seek the good of these people in Babylon who are your captors, right? But like serve them, do good. And also Joseph takes this opportunity to serve a foreign nation that he owes no allegiance to and in fact has every right to be bitter about, right? But he chooses to serve instead.
It says, God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering, and that having gathered the grain and stored it, he had supplies to carry on during the time of famine. So
yeah, I think too, right, like have hope. In the Jeremiah passage, in verse 10, God says, like, I will come to you and fulfill my good promises, right? He's saying, not, I'm coming to you right now, right? But I will have faith, have hope. Similar for Joseph, right? Like, God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. How counterintuitive is that, right? But he has this hope that God's doing a good thing. And I love in 1 Peter, in verse 9, we've been called out of darkness into God's wonderful light. Like, how hopeful is that? That Any last things that we want to put under this? Like, what is God's direction for the people?
It says, show proper respect to everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. What verse is that in again?
16.
Yeah.
What chapter is that in?
2, Peter 2.
Let's do the last question. Is there any ways that you see, even if they're not like actively living it out necessarily in this passage yet, but how might God be inviting people to kind of like shift their perspective or shift their posture based on what we read in the text?
Yeah, for Joseph, it says that he forgot the trouble from his father's house. So there was a shift maybe in his head or in his belief or in his, maybe some of his bitterness or frustration was dealt with in.
Yeah. Anything else that we've seen?
One of the other things with that was Joseph originally was focusing on taking care of the people of Egypt under the guidance of the Pharaoh, but when with the success that he had in the storing the grain, it says all of the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph. They, carried it out in much greater abundance, so it's reaching out to more people.
Yeah, it became not even just about his local country, but what he was doing affected the whole world, and then eventually his own brothers and people, right? So by seeking the good of Egypt, he finds the good of his own family. Any other ways from the other passages that we see maybe an invitation to shift posture?
Well, in 1 Peter, the author reminds us that we're a royal priesthood, the people belonging to God, not to the world.
Yeah.
So that would be the number one thing to keep, even though you're submitting to your masters or to your rulers, that you remember who number one is.
Yeah, because he does call them foreigners and exiles, right? Which is kind of lonely and also like powerless, and it could be hopeless, right? But he is just a verse before said, "You are chosen, a royal priesthood and a holy nation," right? So when you walk around through the world, don't feel defeated. I'm inviting you to remember who you are in Christ, right?
It's quite apropos for what the Wellspring's going through right now. You know, we're walking in this culture where we're not loved by everybody, and we've even seen, some of our parishioners that don't love us and that kind of stuff. So it's important for us to remember that we are to do the things that are right.
Yeah, I really love in 1 Peter how he keeps telling them, like, do good, do good, do good, not just to do it, but so that no one will ever be able to say anything bad about you because you're just such good people, right? It's like, oh, okay. Kind of this encouragement to, like, see everything you're doing as an opportunity to proclaim the truth about who you are and who God is.
But it also has to come from the heart.
Yeah, you want to say more about that?
Well, in Jeremiah it says that you will seek me and find me when you seek me. You will seek and find me when you seek me with all your heart, and I will be found by you. So,
yeah.
That's part of the turning or the posture. It has to come from the heart.
Yeah, when they've been displaced, right? They've literally been taken out of their homeland. They've been displaced. They are literally exiles because they can't go home, right? It would be tempting to just sort of start going through the motions, and maybe you don't want to leave behind who you were, but what's the point of really doing it anymore, right? And I think God is reminding the people, I want your whole life. I want your heart too in these things, which is part of that hope and also the exhortation to act. Yeah, I want to say a little bit more about these three passages and why I chose them specifically. I think Jeremiah is especially encouraging to us as people right now. As I was reading it, I circled the number of times that God says that he's the one that carried them into exile, right? He says it in the first verse, he says it in the last verse, he says it a few times in between. And I think that we can be tempted to think, like, as the culture changes around us, or it starts to look less like people on the outside want to listen to us, that, like, God has abandoned us somehow, right? Or, like, maybe Jesus isn't as powerful as we thought he was because the world out there is going crazy. But actually, we see throughout history that God is in control even in those moments. And actually, he took Israel into exile for a reason. He had a good purpose for them in Babylon. And he has some really beautiful things that he wants them to do, like continue to build families and to build gardens and to prosper and to seek the prospering of the nation that they're in. So they have this opportunity, even in exile, that they wouldn't have had back at home. And God wants that for them for a purpose. And so I think we need to remember that. I love the story of Joseph. I was studying Joseph's story with my students at MJC this semester. And it really stood out to me that as Joseph goes through these really hard experiences, he gets taken away from his home and his family and feels betrayed. He always looked back to God. And then when he gets this opportunity to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, a student reminded me that, like, Joseph not only left his literal home and his literal family, right, but he also left his religion in a way, because in Egypt, they were very polytheistic, right, very global in their sense, where there was influences coming from countries all around. It was a very important country at the time. So Joseph enters into the service of someone who doesn't share his religion, right? And he is serving a group of people that don't share his religion. And even though he keeps holding true to it, the way that he interacts with the Egyptians and how he honors them, and he even, right, he marries an Egyptian woman and he takes an Egyptian name. And he still remembers God in all of those experiences, but the way that he interacts with the Egyptian people is really inspiring to me. And I think something that we could learn from, serving people who are not like us and who don't believe the things that we do, but still holding on to who we are in God, and not being willing to maybe go against the things that we know God is asking us to do, right? And then lastly, the 1 Peter passage. I think in an American culture where often Christians talk about being persecuted or feeling maybe specifically targeted or suffering in some way because of their Christian identity, I think 1 Peter is really encouraging to us, because these were people who were going through the exact same thing, and yet Peter's direction to them is not like, you need to form a rebellion tomorrow, fight back, right? Or like, just give up, leave the country, there's no place for you here. Actually, Peter just encourages them to faithfulness, even where they are at, reminds them of their identity, that they are chosen, that they are royal, a holy nation, God loves them. So it's not a mistake that they're here, but they have an opportunity to do good and to be a witness to the pagan culture around them, even as they interact with it, and continue to engage and don't run away. I feel like all of these things are really relevant to us as we think about what does it mean for us currently to be Christian exiles in a culture that is not our own. But we need to not run away. We need to not be tempted to throw it all out. But how do we seek this third way where we engage but remain who we are and cherish who God has made us to be? Another story that is like really relevant to this and actually runs parallel to the Jeremiah passage is the book of Daniel. And I'm sure people in here are familiar with the story of Daniel. But it offers us this perspective of Israelites who are loyal and serving Babylon, but they're also subversive to the culture at the same time. And they do their best to seek the well-being of Babylon while also speaking out against the idolatry of power that was happening there and the ways that Babylon was offending and going against the one true God. And I really think that we have an opportunity to learn from Daniel's story. So I have a little video that I want us to watch, and we're going to talk about it. It's from a group called the Bible Project, and they make really awesome depictions and explanations of different things in the Bible that are really tangible and easy to grasp in our current culture. So...
In the year 587 BC, the city of Jerusalem was attacked by the Babylonian Empire. And a year later, the city and the temple were plundered and burned.
Thousands of Israelites were taken from their homes and relocated all over ancient Babylon. They became exiles.
And so now they're a minority, surrounded by a new culture with new gods.
Now, some Israelites chose to resist Babylon by revolting or withdrawing. Others gave in, adopting the Babylonian way of life and accepting these new gods as their own.
And you might think those are your only two options, but the prophet Jeremiah told them to do something totally different and surprising. To settle in, build houses, plant gardens, grow families, and most surprisingly, to seek the well-being of Babylon and pray to the Lord on its behalf.
So this is like a third way.
Yeah, it's not compromise or revolt.
What does it look like?
Well, there's a whole book of the Bible that explores that question. It's the story of Daniel.
Daniel was one of the Israelites taken into the Babylonian exile.
And because Daniel had a royal heritage and education, he was recruited along with some friends to work in the high court of Babylon.
Work for the enemy, that would be compromise. Or they could gain the king's trust and take him down from the inside.
That's what you might expect, but instead, they take Jeremiah's advice and choose the third way. They serve the king of Babylon, taking on Babylonian names and even clothing style.
So they seek Babylon's well-being. But in doing so, aren't they just giving up their heritage?
It could seem that way, but actually they aren't. As you read on, the story focuses on moments where they draw the line, and they choose faithfulness to their God and resist the influence of Babylon.
So, for example?
Well, like when they're commanded to bow down to the idol of Babylon and give allegiance to the king as if he's a god.
They won't go that far.
Right. This is where you see their true loyalty. It requires them to critique Babylon's idolatry of power, its arrogance, its injustice, but they do it non-violently by laying down their lives. And so God vindicates Daniel and his friends for their faithfulness.
So they would serve Babylon, seek its well-being, but their loyalty was always to God.
Yeah, this is what Jeremiah was envisioning. The way of the exile is a combination of loyalty and also subversion.
So they're still exiles, but don't Daniel and his friends long to go home?
Yes. In fact, Daniel believed that God was going to send a ruler to bring down Babylon and create a true kingdom of peace.
When did he think this ruler would come?
Well, at first he thought within his lifetime, but then he had a dream where he found out that after Babylon would come another oppressive empire, then another, then another.
And so Babylon did fall, and Israel did get to go back home, but now they're ruled by Babylon's successors.
And so they maintained the mindset of an exile, waiting for their true home to come to them. And they continued the same practice of loyalty and subversion to any new versions of Babylon that came along. And this leads us to the time of Jesus.
The empire of his day was Rome, ruled by Caesar. Now, some Israelites wanted to resist, while others gave in and adopted Roman culture and its gods.
But watch Jesus carry on the subversive loyalty of Daniel. Like when he said, it's fine to pay taxes to Caesar, give him back his coins. But then he said, don't mistake Caesar for God. God's the one who deserves your total life and allegiance.
So the way of Jesus is this same mix of loyalty and subversion.
Yeah, like he taught his followers to love and even bless their enemies. But he also got arrested for speaking out against the corrupt leaders of Jerusalem and Rome. He critiqued their idolatry of power, and it cost him his life. But God vindicated him by raising him from the dead as the true king of the nations.
The king that Daniel had hoped for.
Right. And Jesus promised that one day his kingdom would prevail.
And so until then, his followers are living in a type of exile.
Yeah, this is why the Apostle Peter calls followers of Jesus foreigners and exiles. He told them to respect the authorities of whatever place you happen to live, to honor and love all people, but then he reminds them that this isn't their true home. They're still living in Babylon.
But, well, they're not living in Babylon. Babylon doesn't exist anymore.
Or it doesn't. In the Bible, Babylon has become a symbol that describes any human institution that demands allegiance to its idolatrous redefinitions of good and evil.
Okay, so we all live and work in Babylon. How do I seek the well-being of Babylon while my allegiance is to someone greater?
Yes, Jesus' followers are called to live in that tension between loyalty and subversion. That's the way of the exile.
Yeah, I love where it kind of ends, and I think those are important ideas to be able to hold in tension that requires practice, right? We have to know and hold true to the core elements of our faith. We have to be unwilling to compromise when it comes to honoring God in the most important things in our lives. But meanwhile, we have to choose to love our neighbors and be involved in their lives, whether they share our faith or not, and to seek their good, even if it means that we have to get outside of maybe our faith spaces, right, and maybe be uncomfortable sometimes for the sake of loving and reaching them. I think we can choose to be that kind of faithful exile that goes out and steps out and chooses to be different and kind of weird. Because we know ultimately that our citizenship is in heaven, right? It doesn't belong to any nation, no matter where we find ourselves residing at any given time, right? Ultimately, our home is heaven. And the battle is won. Jesus has died and he has risen. So we don't need to try and win a kingdom for ourselves on earth. He already has one. He will be victorious in the end. We just need to trust God's presence in our lives and continue to seek him no matter where we find ourselves, whether that's in America or someplace overseas or in any country, in any space. We can do the same and we can be faithful, no matter whether we feel like the culture around us runs with our faith or against it. Either way, there's still a call to be faithful. So as we get into like the later half of our time, I want us to be able to contextualize this for ourselves and make it more practical. Like, what does that actually mean for you and me who live here in the Central Valley in Modesto? How do we do that? And I think the easy idea to start with is seeking the good of our neighbors in our city. That's something that feels tangible and feels like something everyone can do, no matter where you live or where you come from. So I want you to just turn back into your small groups real quick. Not that one yet. We'll get there in a second. In your small groups, I want you to talk about just one practical, small way that you could actively seek the good of your neighbors or our city in this next week.
Next week.
Yeah, right now we're gonna do it. It can be a really small thing, but I just want you to talk for a second and discuss those, and then we're gonna share them and make a list so we can see like what are the many opportunities we have to seek the good of our neighbors in our city. So go ahead and just turn real quick and talk about that. I'm gonna make space on the board for us to write our ideas.
So you want to start mowing the lawn? One of the things that really comes to my mind is city ministry network. Work at Cabot, which is a group of people from all churches throughout the area come together once a month. And it's not just necessarily people from churches. It could be, there's people who come in and do presentations. The city manager has come a number of times. The county CEO has come and talked and shared information about what's going on in the community. Part of that gives us a better understanding of what really is going on in the community instead of trying to figure out and interpret ourselves by what we try to make heads or tails out of. But it also gives us an opportunity to relate to each other from different churches and different areas that we wouldn't have the opportunity to do. I was thinking, the examples you gave last week about the diversity in the community. It used to be, I think you listed about 5 or 6 different Christian denominations was the diversity years ago. Now it's Christianity, atheism, Buddhism, and the others that you listed. And it's so easy to
It's not a Christian.
for people to look at those and see them as enemies if they don't think the way I think and believe the way I believe. But it gives us an opportunity at least to get a color from the person. And those are things,
silly things like that.
I don't know much about it.
Two ways that I will was
Muslim, they try to get so, sometimes I just have to have a better understanding of what's going on.
And it's not that I think we should go to Wednesdays. It's just that I think we show them and the kids that come there are from different help others. A lot of them, in fact, they help next
Gated community,
It is.
they've tried several times to have a function that just have to get together.
a couple hot dogs. And then
Yeah, so it's a variety, so, we all have our church already, because their culture is is different in our culture, and our language is different, and they have a tension on trying to fit into just normal American culture, and still showing respect for their parents, and that kind of thing.
I've seen my neighborhood go from
Then, they have a tension of
families with
religious
children,
tension.
the elderly,
I'm kind of that they're dealing with, and we just come in, and
that people across the street have 2 little kids.
but there's not the expectation.
You never see them, never, the kids play in the backyard.
Inundated with storm.
I see him walking the 2 kids to school, and he works nights, so she goes to the weather,
Worthy of their time.
and it's just really, it's sad that
They would necessarily
have neighbors per se,
so many conflicts that they
It's hard today, rather than
do we have them in school?
home, it's just social media.
And
They're in Facebook, Twitter.
not in, but they're surrounded by those.
Over half the people right down the street.
Their parents used to
I know.
This is the
so
interview.
there's wedding blueberries and everything. I mean, they're just a myriad of tensions that those kids are trying to deal with.
It's called to make a decision. Because their parents don't speak English and don't understand the culture. And so when people come in their home to try to deal with those type of situations, they're the only ones that can explain to their parents what's going on. And they become the mediator.
But yeah,
Let's go ahead and come back into the larger group. I love that everyone's talking so much. We have a lot of ideas, which is great. So let's share in the larger group, and I'll write down the ideas we have, and maybe some of them might be more contextual than others, right? It might be that the list we end up with, we couldn't all do every single thing on there, but maybe we can steal a good idea or 2 from our neighbors and try some of these things. So just anybody, go ahead and start. What were the ideas that you talked about of how we could seek the good of our neighbors or our city?
Well, I brought up the fact that we've been sent letters from a group in our neighborhood that they get together every now and then. In the summertime, I think they get together at the little local park area and meeting everybody and stuff. And we've been kind of reluctant to do that. And I don't see the harm in doing that.
Yeah.
To meet them and let them get to know us and.
Is it barbecue?
Yeah, I think so. They have a
Bring your hot dog.
I meet them when I walk the dogs.
But the thing is, if you take the time to respond to something like that, then you meet other people, and it doesn't mean that I have to take on whatever it is they're doing, but they would get to learn more about us as the Christians that we are, and we don't have to tell them to change their lives or anything, but it's just something to be a part of the neighborhood. And I've never done that before, but I feel like it's something that we should do, just because it would be nice.
Yeah, and it'd probably end up being fun for you too. But yeah, even just by choosing to go, you are telling the people who invited you, like, yeah, I do want to know you, right? And how good is a small thing like that in building relationship and even your witness, right?
Right.
Other good ideas, things that you were talking about?
Well, we are in a gated community. We were talking,
everybody pretty much stays to themselves. But I've tried to keep observing if somebody new moves in, you know, go over and say, hi, welcome to the neighborhood. My name's here. If you need any help, my husband and I are right there, you know. Just extend a welcome.
Yeah.
Give them your name, and just so they know that they are welcome in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we're not neighborly anymore. I mean, I'm not talking about us here, but you don't know your neighbor.
That's true.
I mean, in the past, we would always know our neighbors, we'd be in and out of the house, in and out of ours, and it's just not that way anymore.
We had
You're
front
lucky.
porches in those days.
Front porches and not television.
Which might be the way that Jesus is inviting us to be the weird ones and choose to be neighborly anyway. Right? Like, you're right. Like when I moved to the house that I live in right now, no one came to say hi or to greet us. And eventually it took us going out of our way to like talk to neighbors near the front yard or something, right? But if we choose to value that and to getting to know our neighbors, we might be the only ones that come and greet someone new. But we all know that it means something to be welcomed, right? And to know that someone noticed that I showed up, right? And that I matter here.
Can I share a story about that just real quick? I have a friend who's a pastor back in Colorado, and they really dug into this idea and this concept of people don't really know their neighbors. So every Friday morning, their family sets out a table on the sidewalk, offers donuts and coffee, and they've been doing that now for like 2 or 3 years.
That's great.
So for
That's
their,
amazing.
yeah. I know other people who put their picnic table not in their backyard but in their front yard.
Right, right.
The turquoise.
Oh yeah.
That was
Is that
a movement that was a lady
What
put
is it, the turquoise?
a turquoise table, a picnic table, and painted it and spent time out in the front yard so that she'd get to know the rhythm of her neighbors and if people wanted to come and sit with her, they would come, and then she put a prayer box there, and she said people would just pull up, drop the prayer
things off.
and she said it got so big that the whole church had to become involved with the prayers that she was giving. So,
That's cool.
Yeah.
Any other ideas? Related or not? Yeah.
It's children.
At the corner.
If you got children, you'll meet the neighbor.
That's
If you got children, you'll meet the neighbor in the neighborhood.
Yeah,
If
that
you don't
helps.
have children, forget it.
I might feel that way. Something that I've encountered a lot at MJC that I have a pastor friend that works part-time with me through InterVarsity at MJC, and he's about 30 years older than me. And he was really surprised that when he first started coming to campus, all the students wanted to spend time with him and even kind of nicknamed him Dad and stuff. Because he thought like the young kids wouldn't want to hang around with the old guy with a beard, right? But actually, a lot of young people today don't have people like that in their lives, and they actually really want it. So it might feel like it would be hard to connect with people that maybe don't share your generation or maybe are younger than you, but actually a lot of them really want people in their lives that they can look up to and that they can feel cared for and loved by. So don't be afraid. Any other ideas how we can seek the good of our city? Yeah.
The other day I found out more about an organization that's doing a lot of good in Modesto,
What's it called?
the Salvation Army.
Oh, yeah.
And
What's your idea there?
It happened to be their annual Kids Day. I don't know if any of you were driving around, did you pick up a newspaper?
Oh, the
that was on?
newspaper, yeah.
That's their annual collection for fundraising. But they operate a very successful community center in a very poor neighborhood.
Yeah.
And their newspaper tells human interest stories about kids who come there and swim and do their homework and learn more about Jesus, in fact. And I thought, you know, I didn't realize that they had such an outreach to young people in Modesto. I'd like to find out more about it and support it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Here?
Well, also, there's a couple of us that work at another organization, and we operate out of the church across from Modesto High School, and we serve the neighborhood kids there. They come in, we work on Wednesdays, and they come in, we give them a meal. They get to do fun things. They definitely learn about Jesus, but they're not pressured, you know, to do it. And they're kind of a unique community of kids because a lot of them have cultural differences, different first languages. They struggle in school because of that language difference. They have religious differences because some of them have parents that aren't Christian, and so they have to try to figure out that tension between learning about Jesus but respecting what their parents believe. You know, they deal with a lot of tensions. So we try to just give them a happy atmosphere to get a good meal, safe. Yeah, some of them have gang influences in their family or surrounding area constantly. So
is that somewhere that people could volunteer or give time?
Definitely.
What's it called?
Yeah. Healing Nations.
And then you had an idea too?
Yes, when you mentioned the first.
Like this shirt?
No, that's not Healing Nations.
That's Royal Family.
Royal Family.
Royal
Yeah.
Family.
Yeah, go ahead.
The first thing that I thought of is there's an organization in town that called City Ministry Network that has a meeting called Catalyst, the first Thursday of every month, and it's a group that brings people from all churches, ministers and lay leaders and just people that are interested in coming together to share what's going on in your church and your neighborhood and in the community. We've had the city manager come in and talk. We've had the CEO from the county CEO come in and talk about what's going on in the county. We've had people come in and talk about homeless situations and dealing with that. And you end up developing relationships with people from different churches throughout the community that really are really valuable when you're looking for answers, and gives you somebody to go to and help get questions answered that you're dealing with. So.
Yeah, I think spaces like those are really great. It might seem peripheral to like seeking the good because you're not doing anything like directly active, but it's actually a really great place to get to know more that you maybe didn't even know about your city, right? And to discover places where maybe God is inviting you to go somewhere new or to get involved with a different ministry and to serve in that way.
Yeah.
Maybe like one more idea? Yeah.
My wife and I have, I think one reason why maybe we really enjoy working with kids is our grandchildren, they're a little older now, but they were always so far away. So anyway, yeah, we go to the gospel mission every week and we read to them.
Nice.
Done that for years. And then I'm a docent at the museum, so today I gave another tour for the third graders.
Fun.
2 groups, and each of me is like an hour tour of the museum. And that's a kick to see them be amazed by new things.
Yeah, that's really awesome. That's fun. I love reading. And how simple, but a way to like show love and to spend time with people and to choose to be in their lives. I think those are all really great ideas, and I'm sure we have like so many more. I would challenge you to like actually try, right? We can't control if we succeed or not, but to try to do one of these things and to actually do something active where you're like, okay, I'm going to choose as myself, to love my neighbors or to love my city in this one small way. And I think as we do that, we'll begin to see more and more opportunities and ways that God is calling us, even as misfits or exiles in our current culture, to be engaged and to choose in so that we can share our witness with people all around the city. And as you go forward in this class, you'll get to talk more about that, about how do we do these things and how do we hold in tension the honoring God and loving people who are really not like us. So I encourage you to keep choosing into that and to keep learning more and more about it, because it's really tangible and practical. You just have to take the time to learn and to engage. So one more thing I wanted to touch on, and then I have one more question for you. I loved in the end of the video how it was pointing out both with Daniel's story and how him and his friends chose, as they were opposing the unholy forces of Babylon and the opportunities that they had to do that they fought back by laying down their lives, right? And saying like, no, ultimately, I would rather die than offend my God in this way, right? And we see that same thing in Jesus, how he chose to lay down his life in order to combat evil, as opposed to doing it through violence or things like that. And I think that we are invited even today to continue to choose to lay down our lives for others, as we see spiritual forces at work in the world, some of them very evil and some of them at work in our culture and in our cities. We can combat those things in the way of Jesus by choosing to lay down our lives. And I think that's a really beautiful picture of the gospel. And as we choose to do that, I think people will take notice. Because it's not something that people normally do, is to choose to self-sacrifice for the sake of other people. I just want you to take 30 seconds, just in your own head, or if you brought a journal, you can write down notes. But just think, we're not going to share the large group, just in your own self. Just think to yourself, how do you feel challenged by this stuff that we're talking about? And is there one way that maybe you feel like there's a barrier in your life to living this way or choosing into the culture? Just so you can think about and identify that. So I'm going to give you like 30 seconds of silence to just answer this question for yourself. I think as we identify maybe those challenging opportunities to change or shift our perspectives, that's a good call to take it to God and to pray and to ask for his help with those things. I know for me, the way that this kind of conversation always challenges me is in the area of hope. We had talked about earlier how like God calls people to hope when they're in times of exile. And I think I'm someone that I like to call it pragmatism, but I'm actually just like not really an optimist. So for me, like the challenge is when I see opposition in the culture around me is to choose hope and to choose to know that God is at work in those things. That's one way that I constantly have to reset my perspective and shift how I'm thinking about things. So in these last couple of minutes before I welcome back David, I want to spend a few minutes just opening the time up for any questions, both on the things that we talked about tonight and just in the world in general, because I recognize that in my position as like a local missionary who spends all of my time in a secular academic atmosphere with young people who are even younger than me, that maybe I have experiences or knowledge that I could use to help you understand maybe things that seem really jarring or strange about our culture right now. And so if there's any questions either about what we've talked about tonight or just things that you've seen in the world that feel really hard and you feel like you want another perspective on, feel free to ask me. So I'm just going to open it up. You can ask anything you want, but does anybody have any questions?
Working in the colleges that you do, are you finding that more students are becoming aware of Jesus and wanting to know more about him?
Kind of yes and no. So what's interesting and what kind of shocked me as I first started this job, I've been doing it for about 5 years now, was I was shocked by the number of people that just didn't even know who Jesus was. Or like
that
who
shocked me too.
Or maybe knew his name, but if I asked, like, can you explain, like, what do you know about Jesus? They would be like, well, nothing, you know, or like my grandma likes him or something. But in that, I have found that it is an opportunity because a lot of these young people that I work with, being unfamiliar with Jesus creates this opportunity of, well, I get to build the story for the first time then, right? I get to invite them to explore it in a way that they never have before. They don't have a lot of preconceived, like, I already read that book, I don't know what it is, right? And so I do meet a lot of spiritually open students who, whether they know that it's Christianity and Jesus that they're looking for or not, they do want to talk about those bigger questions and like, how do you answer why your life has value, right? How do you answer what are you supposed to be doing in these, 50 to 90 years that you have on the earth? And it's also a generation that really honors and values and respects people's stories, which gives me a platform to share mine, right? And to be heard. and to be listened to. So I think that it is a time where it might feel like people aren't very open to Christianity as they imagine it to be, but are actually really open to hearing my story of how Jesus has changed my life and asking their questions, right? So in some ways, both yes and no. Yeah. Any other questions about this or other things? Yeah.
From our own children's experience with IV on their campuses, we'd like to know more about how InterVarsity Christian Fellowship is organized and how you are paid. All right.
Well, it's organized, so InterVarsity, for those who aren't familiar with it, is essentially like the United States version of a larger global movement called the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students. And so what it is movements of students on college campuses all around the world that want to live out their faith actively during their time in college and want to share their faith with their peers. What I do as a staff worker with InterVarsity is I come alongside students and I resource them and I train them and I coach them. I'm like, you want to be a leader but you don't know how? Well, let me show you, right? And I give them the tools that they need to share their faith if they've never done that before, and I give them the tools that they need to be able to lead others and train others how to do that as well. So usually what happens is a staff worker like myself gets sent to a campus or a number of campuses, and we just go and we kind of do the Jesus thing where we walk around and we find people in boats and say, hey, come here. And then we just start. We run with who wants to run, and we build movements on campus. We are funded through the support and partnership of local churches and individuals. So just like you would think of any overseas missionary and how they raise support and things like that, I do the same thing. So it's very similar to how you think of overseas missions. I just do it here because there are kids that don't know Jesus here. And they matter to Jesus too.
And is that related to Campus Crusade?
We are very similar organizations, and actually last year we started, it's called the Every Campus Initiative. Both Campus Crusade and InterVarsity are similar organizations, so they're not the same. And we do similar things, but both of us together are only on about 600 of the nearly 2,000 universities in America. And so we want to work together to be able to reach all of those universities by the year 2030. So that's something that we're doing together right now. So we're not the same, but we do work together.
That's good. It's the same God.
Yes. Same Jesus, so. Yeah.
I can say that when I was a college student for a couple of years at San Francisco State, I really appreciated InterVarsity. They had a guy named Jim Burney, and he later became one of the leaders, I think. But anyway, that meant a lot to have someone who would sit down at the table in the coffee shop and we would talk about spiritual and theological issues. When I went to UC, though, down in San Diego, it was a new campus. I don't know what IB does at other UC campuses, but this was new, and there wasn't any group, organized. So I really missed it.
Yeah. I think for Christian students who maybe went to church with their parents in high school or something like that, and then are going to college, community is really important, and having fellow Christians to encourage you and to do mission with, it's really important. And I think having that space of community, like you're saying, is a good place to welcome in new people. So I think it's important, whether with InterVarsity or any other thing, I would hope that the churches that have colleges and universities in their towns would care about those colleges and universities. Because there are people there that really need community and Jesus. So, yeah. Any other questions about living in exile or anything else?
So I don't know, maybe we'll talk about this at a later time, but I just know that one of my tensions in living in exile is showing love. That's not a problem, but not having that affirmed as maybe approval. That Christ would find that that's okay. Like if you're invited to a wedding of same sex, do you go because you love those people? Because I do. But then would others, or would that seem as if that's approving of that. To not go seems harsh, to go seems, I don't know. And so I find that I'm just using that one example, but I think there are millions of those kinds of examples. So I find that tension in my life.
Yeah, that's real. And I think, I don't know if David plans to cover things like that for sure, but maybe the fact that the question's being asked will mean that he might.
Yeah, come on. Tackle it.
But I would just say, like,
I'll make sure to give you all a checklist. To go
from like a starter perspective, I would say that is, right, there's no verse in the Bible that says, thou shalt not go to, right? So I think that really has to come down to a matter of your own conscience and like really asking God, right? Because I think there is opportunity, like you're saying, to going to a wedding like that and showing like, hey, like maybe we don't agree, but I do still love you and I do care, right?
Exactly.
There's value there.
Yeah.
There is value also in being clear. So I think there's probably not hard and fast rule on that, and it's more about like asking God, what do you want me to do right now? Because this is hard. And then
relationship.
He promises He hears us when we ask Him things,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
So I think it's good to press into that with Jesus and community.
Yeah.
Yeah, I might talk about that a little bit the last week. Today, this class, as it was mentioned before, could go like 13 weeks. So this is like intro level of that conversation today. So I'm just happy that we're, having the conversation, so yeah.
Maybe space for one more question before I welcome Dave back up, and if not, that's okay too.
So what do you think that young people struggle with the most? As I know I had a lot of struggles going through college about different things, but with the culture change now and so many, I still have that core kind of thing of Christian kind of framing my thoughts and things, but now they don't have that. That's that big challenge. They must be pulled in 1,000 different directions. I don't know.
That's true, and I think there are some interesting statistics. This generation, and probably coming generations of college students and young people in that age group experience depression and anxiety at way higher rates than like any previous generation. Like it's almost 70% of students, which is crazy, right? But I think there's things that feed into that. One is, I think especially for students that don't follow Jesus, right? It's like you look at the world and you think where there isn't hope. Like why do I have any cause to have hope for my future or the future of this place, right? No matter like what political side you come from or what culture or background you come from, you look out and you're like, that's a mess, right? So So I think there's a lot of forces at play, and as much as maybe we feel lost in our culture, young people do too. Maybe for different reasons, but they feel the same things. And I think feeding into that also is a sense of not having a lot of self-value, which is interesting because a lot of people critique the culture that these children were raised in as like being too affirming of who they are and things like that. But I find a lot of young people making jokes about how they're like actual trash or like they don't value themselves. And I think that's maybe having taken things that they were told and like brought them in and made them theirs, right, and accepted those sorts of things as who they are. But I think a lot of young people just don't know why they have any value, and so because of that, it is also hard to have hope, right? So I think those are things that young people really struggle with. But yeah, I'm gonna ask David to come up. I know he has a few announcements and last words, but thanks for participating.
So, as you were talking, I just grabbed these if you're interested. I mentioned this one last week. This is You Lost Me. And this is basically statistics, all this data gathered on 18 to 29-year-olds and why they're leaving the church and what we can do about it. So if you want to take a picture of this, write it down. If you're interested, it's a fantastic book. It's on audiobook too. That's how I first consumed it. And then this one, Growing Young. And this is just talking about some practical ways a church can grow young. If you're interested, you can take a look at this, take a picture of it, write it down. So I just thought of that as you guys were chatting. So actually, I don't have a whole lot next week. You're gone next week, correct?
I will be at camp.
So real quick, Do you mind telling them what you're doing, and then we'll pray for you in our closing prayer too in that. So.
Yeah, it's actually my favorite thing that I get to do all year. Next week I'm going to camp with InterVarsity from Modesto Junior College and also Sonoma State and UC Merced and Merced College. And what we do is we spend a week deeply studying the book of Mark together. And you might think that young people would find that boring, but actually it's not. We spend 8 hours a day going through the book of Mark, and we go at such a pace that you can only finish half of it in 1 year, and then they got to come back to finish it. But what I love about that is as we discuss it in community and kind of wrestle with and ask questions and see like how does Jesus answer our questions, students come away realizing that maybe they didn't understand how alive and real Jesus was before, and as we walk through his story with him and see the things that he did and things that he taught when he was here on earth, he really comes alive to students and invites them to be transformed. So I'm going to go spend 5 days with my students there. I'm going to be leading students through the second half of Mark, which I love because right in the middle of Mark, I don't know if you've ever noticed when you're reading it, but Jesus suddenly like turns and gets really hardcore and starts saying really strong things like you got to lose your life to save it and stuff like that. And I love intense conversations. So yeah, if you're going to pray for me, please pray for my energy because I'm not a night owl and all those kids are. And for the students that they would have soft hearts because specifically as I'm teaching the second half of Mark, Jesus is going to say some hard things and he's going to call them to come and die with him so that they can rise with him. But sometimes it's hard because dying doesn't sound fun.
No.
But, yeah.
Right.
Okay. And then, so next week, talking about discipleship, like I said, the first week, it's kind of the sweet sauce. It's kind of like the way in which God has called the church to multiply and function, both inside the walls but outside. So we're going to talk about discipleship. What is a discipleship? What does it mean to disciple other people? I think there's some misconceptions in that. I think that the church as a whole, nationwide and possibly worldwide, it's our one mission, and I don't think we fully understand it nor do it. And so we're going to be talking about that next week, and then we'll close the next week conversation, getting into a little more detail. This is really good, but we're going to talk a little bit about, we're going to get into what are the non-negotiables and what are the things that are worth flexing on, and then how to, as Jesus took on skin of humanity and became, we say, incarnate and moved into the neighborhood, what does it look like for us then to, in a sense, move into the neighborhood with the world around us? So talk about that, and then we have a night of worship the 6th, and then that'll close out for the summer our Christian education. Yeah, 2 more. So if you didn't catch in the stream, that was bumped to the 6th, and the reason being is I moved my vacation back a week, partially because, if you don't know, Becca and Jeff are moving back to Colorado. I have family in town around that week, and we're helping pack and stuff. So I moved my vacation back a week, and by doing that, I'm cutting off the last week of this class so that we can have a night of worship, because I'd love to just cap off the Christian education season with the night of worship. So, cool. Any other questions on that? Awesome. So here's what I'd like to do. Can you actually stand up here? Would 2 people like to pray, not only to close the class, but also pray for Lauren and the ministry at Mark Camp? So 2 people, and then I'll close. So you will come on. Oh yeah, you can come on. That would be awesome. So one other? Does anybody else? Okay.
Father, we just come to you tonight and we give you thanks for this time that you've given us together to study this message that Lauren has given us. And we thank you for that. We thank you for her, for you using her as a conduit to share this message. We just pray for her as she goes to camp this coming week, Lord, that you will just fill her with energy and an abundance of enthusiasm that she can share with these students, children, whatever age they might be, and to give her the words to say to them that you can share, that she can share with them to help them understand what your son is all about, and to give them the enthusiasm and the curiosity, if nothing else, to learn more about that, and just help Lauren to guide them as they go through this process, and to draw them ever close to you.
Father, I thank you for Lauren's heart, for her passion for you, for her love that is so obvious, Lord. And also for the love that she has for those around her. And Father, for the obedience that she walks in to follow in your path and to do those things that you have equipped and called her to do. Father, I do also pray, as my brother has prayed, for energy and for just a time of joy in serving these kids at camp. And it does require a lot of energy and just helping her to step out in those areas that are not her strengths, Lord God, the night owl hours. And Father, we know though that you will be there with her and that you will equip her, that you will give her the energy, and we just pray a time of blessed divine moments for that whole time, Lord God, that time will be used for you and be fruitful and a blessing to all.
God, we thank you so much for tonight and the conversations that was led, and God, we are aware that you were here tonight, and thank you for using Lauren's direction and kind of thought process and her style of conversation tonight. God, for you to speak to us. Help us put moments into practice, God, as you lead us from whatever was opened in our eyes tonight. And Lord, I pray that you bless Lauren's week next week. I know that the students, the ones that I know, have talked about how excited they are about it. And Lord, I pray that not only would that excitement come with anticipation that they meet with you, but God, that you would say some things, whether hard things, exciting things, challenging things, to move people forward in their maturity with you, to maybe consider you for the first time or consider you in different ways. God, thanks again for tonight, and God, I pray that you, God, out of this, we walk out of here with a freshness and maybe a new understanding and a new perspective of what you're doing in our world. We pray this in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all. If you're, we have the sign up for meals over there, and if you're willing to help clean up after that.
It's okay, I'm just gonna grab this.
Thank you.
The brownies, I promise, have arrived, so please take some before you leave.